All right. Well, today is a much more uplifting verse, story, passage that we're looking at today compared to the last 3 weeks, which we've been looking at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's been interesting. I have found it interesting. I hope you did too. And enlightening and eye-opening. Today is a much happier passage. We're going to look at the birth of Isaac today. Now, one thing to, I think, recognize is that joy, and we're going to see joy in this story today, is even more pronounced after a season of struggle or suffering, right, or darkness. And we have all been through seasons of struggle, suffering, darkness. I have been. But there are things that can help us get through those difficult times. And one of the things that I have found was thinking of my life as a story. So I was going through a really hard thing about 10 years ago, and I had a moment where I thought to myself, man, if my life was a movie, this is that part of the movie where the audience would be like on the edge of their seats thinking, what's going to happen next? Because that's kind of what I was thinking. All right, what's going to happen next? And so I started thinking about my life in terms of a story, and I've been kind of having this sense of fear, like, what if this is the end of my story? Please, God, don't let this be the end of my story. And then I started to say to myself, wait, no. This is just a chapter in my story, right? There's another chapter coming in my story. And yes, this is a really hard chapter, but this is just a chapter in my story. When we can think of our lives in terms of chapters and as a story, I have found that it is so helpful, right, to get through those dark and difficult times. So in terms of the story of Abraham and Sarah, they have been in a fairly difficult chapter of their lives, right? 25 years prior to what we're looking at today, God had come to Abraham and said, Abraham, you're going to have a son. And I'm going to make you into a great nation, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And Abraham and Sarah, who were unable to have children, rejoiced. And they said, woohoo, we're going to have a baby. And then they didn't. And then they didn't again. And they kept not having a baby. And God would say, yeah, it's coming, you're going to have a baby. And 25 years passed. 25 years until finally God gave them Isaac. Right? So in that time, right, in those 25 years, lots of frustration, and we looked at some of those stories, lots of trying to take matters into their own hands, trying to get this done in some very unhealthy ways. Lots of doubt, and lots of listening to God again, saying, oh, no, I promise this is coming. But really, right? And so finally, we come to this part of the story here. This is the birth of Isaac, Genesis 21, verses 1 through 7. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, probably with some laughter, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age, right? So this profound joy. I think it's interesting that the story, the way it's told, focuses on Sarah, right? It starts with the words, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah. Does that mean that God was not also gracious to Abraham? No, of course, God was also gracious to Abraham. But the author of this story is not focusing on Abraham. He's focusing on Sarah. Why is that? I mean, we don't know exactly what was in the mind of the author of the story, right? But I think it probably has something to do with the fact that A mother is far more connected to her pregnancy, right, than the husband is, right? I mean, there's a deep connection, right, that us guys don't really understand, I suspect. I mean, I can't even really say that for sure. I mean, we can kind of feel connected. Oh, look, I saw a kick. Yay, go baby, But a mother, right, shares nutrients and blood, right, with the baby. There is a deep connection. And when there is an inability then to have that kind of a deep connection, to have that kind of life inside of you when you long for it so much, I think Sarah felt that pain way more than Abraham did. I think there's also the fact that the inability to have children, especially in those ancient times, it was a shame, right, and a stigma associated with the inability to have children. It's not, we kind of have that a little bit even today, right? You say, oh, why haven't you had children yet? Without thinking what that might, communicate. But there was a stigma that she carried. There was this burden of barrenness that she carried with her. And it was really painful for her. And so all these years, she's carrying this burden of brokenness, barrenness, these feelings of abandonment, like, is God even with me, right? And so finally, after all these years, God is gracious to Sarah. Yes, to Abraham too, but to Sarah. Because of this stigma, this shame that she carried, right, these are the kinds of things that make us feel sort of second rate. I think she would have probably felt inadequate, right, inferior. We know that when Hagar, Sarah's servant, who was illicitly sort of impregnated by Abraham as a way to try to take things into their own hands, we talked about this earlier this year, she felt envy. She couldn't stand it, right? Because she felt inferior in some ways. I'm not able to give this to the world, to Abraham, right? I can't do this. She felt inadequate. She felt second rate. And I suspect all of us have been in those times, have had those times where we felt sort of inferior or second rate or inadequate in some ways. Right? We human beings tend to play the comparison game, right? We look at other people who have more, or who have something that we don't have, or who have achieved something, or who have some kind of a goodness in their life that we perceive that we wish we had. Now, thankfully, social media has made it much easier to avoid comparison. No, right? But we do that. We compare ourselves. I mean, I still do it. I still do it because I'm a human being. I think I would say I did it even more when I was younger, a young pastor, right? And I'd be like, man, how come I can't? I wanted to be a big church pastor. That's what I wanted, right? And I'm like, how come that guy gets to be in that big church and I don't, and I have to be in this little church, right? What does he have or she have that I don't have, right? And I would compare myself, and I would feel in some ways inferior or inadequate or second rate because of that. That's what Sarah was feeling, right? And so for 25 years, she was comparing herself to all those other women who were able to have children, to all those families who had maybe huge families, right? Lots of children. And all these years, she's feeling hopeless. She's feeling alone. She's feeling abandoned. And then, finally, Isaac is born. And it's like this relief, right? Oh, finally, at last, right? And even we, the reader, right? We've been waiting. When is Isaac finally going to be born? This baby that God keeps promising. You know, it was in chapter 12, Genesis 12, that God makes the promise. We're in chapter 21. That's 9 chapters. Why didn't God just fulfill the promise in chapter 13, right? Like all this time, and we're waiting. When is God going to fulfill this promise? When is the baby going to be born? When is the blessing going to become possible because they're going to have a baby, right? And finally, you and me, right? We can breathe a little easier. Oh, thank goodness the baby has been born, right? And we can kind of rest in the hope of that, the joy, right? The relief of that. As we read the story, right, we also are reminded of the significance of Isaac's name, right? There's joy in the birth of Isaac. Anybody remember what the name Isaac means? I mentioned it once a little while ago. Anybody remember? Was it? He laughs. He laughs. Laughter. I think I heard laughter. It was here's what I heard from you guys. That's what it had sounded like to me over here. Anyway, yes, it means laughter. He laughs, right? Why was Isaac's name Isaac? Why was his name Laughter? Well, here's where God first tells them, you're going to name him Isaac. God is the one who actually names him. In chapter 17, now, Abraham and Sarah have been waiting at this point for 15 years at this part of the story, chapter 17, and God says, no, Abraham, I promise, you're going to have descendants as many as the stars in the sky and as many as the sand on the seashore. And in verse 17, it says, Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? It's crazy. Right? And then God said, verse 19, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. Okay, if you're going to laugh at my promise, then let's just call him Laughing Boy, right? Let's just call him Laughter. Okay, right? A little bit later, chapter 19, now this would be only a year before Isaac is born. You may remember this story. God comes with two angels, essentially, in the form of three men. And they say, hey, Abraham, Sarah, you're going to have your baby. We're going to be back next year at this time, and you will have a son by then. And Sarah hears this kind of from, she's inside the tent. Here it is, chapter 18. Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. Right? That's a certain kind of laughter, right? It's a cynical kind of laughter. Come on, don't be crazy. Ha, 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 right? It's that kind of laughter. There's a different kind of laughter in this story, right? In verse 6, it says this, Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me, right? This is a different kind of laughter. This is the laughter of utter joy. And no longer will people laugh at me because of my misfortune. People will laugh with me because they are rejoicing with me, right? That's the kind of laughter that we see here. There's something wonderful about laughter, right? You guys have heard about the research that shows that there's some kind of a healing effect when it comes to laughter, right? It's good for you. During a very dark time about 10 years ago, that same season where I was like, oh, let me think of my life as chapters in a story. I discovered a show called Impractical Jokers. Anybody know that show? Yeah. Anybody like that show? Okay. So it's not for everybody, right? Some people are like, this makes me really uncomfortable, but it is the greatest show in the history of TV, almost, at least comedy. It's like this reality hidden camera TV show where these four buddies, these lifelong friends, put each other in situations where they have to do really uncomfortable, embarrassing things. And it is hilarious. And I was on sabbatical during this season of my life, the first part of it, and things were really hard, but I didn't have to get up in the morning. It was the summer, the kids were off from school, and so I'm kind of a night owl, and I would be up until 2 or 3 in the morning just watching recordings. We DVR'd it, right? One after another of Impractical Jokers, and I would just laugh and laugh and laugh, and it was literally a gift from God. And it helped me get through that very difficult season. Laughter, right, has a healing effect. It's also kind of an expression of wonder, right? Wow, right? That kind of laughter. I came across a great little story in a book that I'm reading right now, and it's about a guy named Enad. And the author is J.R. Briggs. It's in a book called The Art of Asking Better Questions, and he tells this story. He says, Enad is a medical student who grew up in the United Arab Emirates and attends our church. After the service ended on a cold January morning, a few of us were standing around talking when he mentioned he'd been excited over the past few days, as it was the first time in his life he had ever seen snow. We learned Enad had never thrown a snowball. With snow still blanketing the ground, our group of 5 or 6 adults put our things down. Come with us, we said. We marched outside and participated in a friendly snowball fight. Enad smiled from ear to ear while he made his snowballs, giggling and shrieking when he got nailed and when he blasted others. He made a small snowman and learned how to make a snow angel. We all laughed until our stomachs hurt. It only lasted a few brief minutes, but it was a beautiful, soul-filling experience of joy, right? Laughter. And then there's also the kind of laughter that comes when we discover something profound, or we experience something profound in regard to who we are and who God is. There's a play that I came across. I've not seen the play, but it's called Lazarus Laughed. And it's the story of Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead, after Jesus had raised him from the dead. And there's a beautiful description of Lazarus and Jesus, right, immediately after Lazarus comes out of the tomb. And the description comes from a character, one of the characters who helped roll the stone away from in front of Lazarus' tomb. And here's what that character says. It says, and then Lazarus knelt and kissed Jesus' feet. Both of them smiled. And Jesus blessed him and called him my brother and went away. And Lazarus, looking after him, began to laugh softly, like a man in love with God. Such a laugh I have never heard. It made my ears drunk. It was like wine. And though I was half dead with fright, I found myself laughing too. Laughter, that kind of wholesome, deep laughter from inside our souls is what we experience, right, when we discover the shalom of God, right, the goodness of God, the healing of God, the fullness of God, right? And it's like we just want to overflow with joy, laughter. It doesn't have to be a weird, like, strange kind of laughter, but just like I can't believe this, amazing. Sarah laughed, right? Because she had experienced the shalom of God, the fullness of God, the healing of God, the faithfulness of God, right? After all these years that God had said, I'm taking care of you, I'm with you, I promise, I made a promise, I'm going to make you and your descendants into a great nation. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Finally, God fulfilled the promise, and Sarah laughed for joy. After 25 years of barrenness and brokenness, and feeling abandoned and alone, finally, oh, God is faithful after all. I think it's worth considering what God was faithful to. If we say that God is faithful, we see that God is faithful to his promise, right? What was his promise to Abraham and Sarah? Now, we might say that God gives sort of unique promises to each of us, but there are also big promises that he gives to all of us. The promise that he loves us, the promise that he's with us. For Abraham and Sarah, he gave them the promise of life, right? There will be life that comes from you. This is not the end, the end of your lineage. That was part of their fear, that their line, their family would die with them. No, there is life for you, and that life will become a great nation. There's also the promise of blessing, God was faithful to his promise of life. God was faithful to his promise of blessing, his promise that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you, Abraham and Sarah, through your descendants. God was faithful to that promise. And I think it's reasonable, right, to think of God, that this is God's promise to us as well, life and blessing, right? God promises us eternal life and abundant life. This is why Jesus came into the world, to bring that kind of life, to help us understand and embrace and live into that kind of life. God promises life. God promises blessing. Not only that we will be blessed, but that God will bless others through us, right? That's a promise we can all hold on to. God will be faithful to that promise. And then I also want to say that the birth of Isaac was sheer gift, right? It was, story starts, this passage. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, right? Grace, there are a few different ways to define what grace is, but one of my favorite definitions of grace is that it's an undeserved gift, right? That's what grace is. It's an undeserved gift. They did not do anything to earn the birth of Isaac, right? In fact, they did a lot of stuff to unearn it, one might argue. But God was gracious. They did nothing to earn it. They didn't do anything to deserve it. But God said, I'm going to give you this gift, right? Because I've promised it. I promise. The promise was a gift, right? Sheer gift, sheer gift. Right, Sarah discovered that God is a faithful God. And nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing can keep us from what God has for us. Sarah was able to trust, learned to trust in God's faithfulness. Right? We can learn to trust in God's faithfulness. And here's where I want to finish this. When we go through dark times, it can be really hard, right, to trust that God is faithful. Right? It's in those really dark times that we say, what are you doing? What? Why are you letting this happen to me? Right? Why should I trust you if this is what you're going to allow? Right? And then God comes through. And then we get through that chapter, right? And we're like, oh, God was faithful after all. Let me share one quick story. When I was in my 20s, okay, first of all, let me say this. I've shared with you guys that when I was a kid, I wanted to make it big in Hollywood, right? I wanted to be a movie star when I was little. I wanted to be a movie director when I got into high school and college, and I did work in Hollywood for a couple of years. I was a production assistant on a few TV specials and a few music videos, and I got to work on a Muppets music video, which was super fun, right? But I kind of developed this love-hate relationship with Hollywood because it's also just kind of, it's pretty cool, but it's also a little bit yucky, and maybe a lot yucky the deeper you get into it. And there's this clear hierarchy, of the people at the top are treated like gods, and the people at the bottom are treated like people at the bottom, And I was at the bottom, and I was like, I don't like this. And so I was getting frustrated with my time in Hollywood, and I thought, okay, what can I do to kind of get ahead a little bit more? And so I decided that I would take a class in Burbank on using the Avid editing system, which was the state-of-the-art editing system, computer editing system, a brand new thing back in the early and mid-90s. Right, prior to that, it was all like tape-to-tape or film, and this was new, computers. Now, the editing systems we have on this is way more powerful than that original ginormous computer editing system called an Avid. But I took this class. It's like a 3-day intensive. I paid $800 of my own hard-earned credit card, and $800 in 1995 or 6 or whatever is like, I don't know, $3,500 today. That was a lot of money for a 22-year-old, So I took this class, and it was great, and I learned it. I was like, yeah, I love this, and I really enjoyed editing. right? That was my favorite part of the video production process. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do this. So eventually I got another job. Everything is like short-term jobs in Hollywood for this production or that production. And I got a job through a temp agency at a company called Creative Domain that makes movie trailers. And that was kind of cool. And I was like, okay, yeah, good. I can get some editing experience here. I started kind of as just the office boy, and but there were the editors, and some of them had started as office boys. And it's kind of neat to see these trailers come together and to see the dailies from these movies come in, and then the editors would take these dailies and put something together. And then the guy who did all the voiceovers would come in, the guy who would say, in a world where blah, 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 that guy who was like this tall with dark black hair, and a little bit like that. Anyway, I'm like, he does not look like that voice at all. Anyway, kind of fun. And I was there for about 3 weeks. The idea was after 3 weeks, they would decide whether or not to keep me on full-time permanently. And they said, well, we're not going to keep you. I was like, oh, why not? And they said, well, you could have offered to stay late, more often, meaning without pay, which I think is illegal today in terms of California labor laws. But at that time, like you could do that, right? And I don't know. So I was like, oh, okay. So that was it. And then I was just like, you know what? I think I'm done with this. And that was actually really hard for me because this Hollywood dream had been with me for as long as I could remember. Like it was like an appendage, Giving up that dream was like cutting my arm off. I didn't even know, I didn't know who I was without, who am I without this? What do I do now? And so I ended up considering a few different options. The soonest thing that I could get into in terms of just keeping my life moving was I could get into Fuller Seminary that fall. I was like, all right, I'll apply to Fuller and see what happens, So I got into Fuller. It was really, truly, I went to Fuller because I didn't know what to do with my life. And I was like, well, here I am. I need a job. So I looked at the job board, and there was an opening for an on-call media technician for the media center, 10 hours a week. And I was like, oh, that sounds good. Part-time, on campus, in my, wheelhouse. And so I applied for the position, got the interview, went down to the basement of the library, which is where the media center was located, for the interview, went in. The director of the media center, welcomed me, invited me back into his cubicle, his part of the office. And I sat down with him, and it was kind of a big-ish cubicle. It wasn't like a tiny cubicle. And I noticed that on the other side, so it was kind of set up for two people, on the other corner of his cubicle was an Avid. And I said to him, oh, you have an Avid? He said, yeah, we just got it. You know how to use it? I said, yeah, I took a class. Like all this time, I had thought, what a waste that I spent all this money on this class. And now I was going to get to do it anyway. And it was like this gift from God, right? Now, God was gracious to Markus. That's how it felt, right? Yes, Markus, you gave up your Hollywood dream, but you're going to still get to do what you love doing, right? Video editing, video production. Eventually, I got the title, video production coordinator for the seminary, and it was God's way of saying, Markus, you're in the right place. This is where I wanted you. And so I got to study theology and the Bible and grow in my faith. I got to do the kind of work that I loved doing, and without all the ugliness and yuckiness of Hollywood, right? And what a gift that was. And I kid you not, there were times when I would laugh, just be like, I can't believe this, Lord. How amazing that you gave this to me after all this, after making this really, really hard decision, right? God doesn't always come through in exactly the way we want him to. And even here, in this case, God didn't come through the way I thought he would. Like if he had answered my prayer, I would have, become I would have been the next Steven Spielberg, right? That would have been the answer to my prayer. That's not the answer that God gave me. But he was faithful, right? And he gave me what I wasn't expecting, and it was good, right? So, right, I don't know where you're at in your life right now. Maybe you're going through a hard time. If you're not going through a hard time, you have been through a hard time, and we've all got hard times coming. Right? Wherever you are in your life, this is a chapter in your story. Right? And even if it feels like God is not with you right now, he is, right? And he will fulfill his promises. And it may not look exactly like what we want, but God is with us and God is faithful. And even if this is a season where we can't laugh very well, right? That time will come and we will find that God has been gracious to us, and we will laugh, and all those who hear about what happened to us will laugh with us. Jesus, thank you that you are faithful to us. Thank you that you are a God of joy, of hope, of laughter. Lord, we pray that you would be with us, each of us, in whatever season of life we find ourselves in right now. If we are in a good, happy, hopeful season of life, we thank you and we rejoice. If we're in a dark, difficult season of life, Lord, remind us that you are with us and that you will be with us through this season, and that this is just a chapter. And Lord, I guess I want to say we all eventually come to that final chapter of our lives, at least here in this life. But even that, Lord, is not the end. Even that is just a chapter. And we look forward, Lord, to the ultimate chapter, being with you face to face, fully and completely. We thank you that that is your promise to us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.